Hello and welcome back to my channel, Thrifty Day. My name is Leah. I'm the creator behind Thrifty Day. Today's episode is a DIY. I am going to show you how I made this junk journal out of an old book. So let me just show you a few of the pieces that I was very much inspired by. I have a couple of these postcards from a postcard book that my daughter purchased for me. I have multiple Tim Holtz items. They were on sale at Joann's, so I picked up a whole bunch of goodies, including those butterflies that I end up using. Most of these pieces I actually don't end up using in my journal, but they were really inspiring and I think had a really good sort of aesthetic and vibe. And so I will be using them in my October Patreon journals, but I didn't really end up using a lot of them in my personal journal. I knew I wanted to use that lace and that beautiful mushroom fabric that I actually got at the dollar store of all places. And these are a couple old books that were headed for the trash. And so I end up using that mustard color one because it's just a little bit bigger. I use papers from two different paper pads. Both are from Joann's. One is called Forager and one is called Simple Life. They are one-sided cardstock, which is fine because I end up making pockets out of them, so they end up sort of being double-sided, and you'll see that later on in the process. But I thought I would give you a flip through of these paper pads because I really loved the paper, and I think they had the exact sort of autumn fall vibe I was going for. So let's get into the tutorial. So the first thing I need to do is create the spine. I'm going to use some medium weight chipboard. The width is about a penny. It's not that thick. And I make a spine that will be about 2.5 inches. You could make your spine as wide or as thin as you would like. And then I'm going to use some of this mushroom fabric and I'm just going to rip it. The reason is I like that frayed edge. I don't want it to look perfectly cut and perfectly angular. I don't mind little strings and I don't mind imperfections. So I just cut a strip long enough that will wrap all the way around that spine that is the exact same length as my book. So let me show you how I take apart an old book. It's a very simple process. You do just need to be careful. I am going to use this X-Acto knife and I'm just going to cut down the sides and that will maintain the entire book. Now you can stick your cardstock or your chipboard right in the center there and keep your book intact and create a journal in that manner. But I'm actually going to go ahead and remove that spine, save it for later, and I'm going to add the new chipboard spine that I just cut out. This way I can have a little bit bigger of a journal. I can add a little bit more pages. And so I'm just going to make sure my fabric is long enough and wide enough to accommodate my spine and the book. And then I'm going to use Mod Podge generously. I'm going to coat one side of that spine and I'm going to place it face down on the mushroom fabric strip that I have cut. You will want to make sure that chipboard is right in the center because now we are going to add the front cover and the back cover onto the overhanging fabric, and that's going to hold your entire journal together. So be very generous with that Mod Podge. It does dry clear, so you can use a whole bunch and not be worried that it's going to look super gloppy or show through. Once you have the front cover done, you want to work on the inside. Again, add a generous amount, and you're going to fold that fabric right over. In this step, it's okay if they don't line up exactly perfect because I am going to be putting inside covers, decorative inside cardstock covers. So if it doesn't line up perfectly, your fabric, don't worry about it. Don't stress too much. You actually won't be able to see most of this. And I do add another layer of Mod Podge right over the top of that fabric just to make sure everything is sealed down and to add a whole nother layer of flexibility and durability. Now that step is complete. You're going to want to let it dry at least 30-40 minutes maybe. You do want it to be totally dry to the touch. And then I'm going to add another layer of Mod Podge, once again, to seal in the front cover for durability and flexibility. And again, let that completely dry to touch. I do have to admit, I tend to get a little impatient on this part and don't always wait for it to dry, but I definitely recommend that you do. Once it dries mostly to touch, this is where if you want a rounded spine, this is your moment to do that. The chipboard will still be a little wet even though the fabric is not, and that's where you can sort of create that rounded edge. And then when you let it completely dry, the spine will then dry rounded. So that's where you make it look like a real book, if that's what you want. Otherwise, you can just leave it totally flat and straight. So now that we've set our journal aside to completely dry, we can construct our signatures. These are the papers I'm using. I'm trying to make everything in this journal, all of the pages, vintage. And my reasoning for that is I would like to be very inspired, and I feel that that sort of worn vintage look will really add to the autumn vibe that I'm trying to capture. So I'm using children's workbooks, children's magazines, decorative bags, vintage wallpaper, vintage type letters. I love old children's craft books. I think those are really fun to add pages because it's crafting, and I don't know, I always feel like that sort of flies. Vintage sheet music, and I chose this one specifically because it's I Hear a Forest Praying, and I think with fall and autumn, I definitely have a nature vibe going here. And I also am using this Smokey the Bear little workbook flyer. That was these two books and the book I'm making this journal out of were headed for the trash. So anytime I can use books that were literally headed for the trash, it's a winning day. So lots of these goodies. I also do have some coffee stain paper that I don't end up using, but I thought just in case I needed a few extra pages. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how I make these pockets out of cardstock. It's a super simple process. You probably already know how to do it, but let me go ahead and show you anyway. I already measured the length of my journal, and so I'm going to trim down 2 pieces of cardstock that will be the exact same height so that they will fit into my journal perfectly. Then I get my fabric tack and I glue the top closed and the bottom closed, but I leave the sides open. So I'm going to carefully put one of those pieces of cardstock onto the piece of cardstock that I added the glue. I'm going to press firmly, and if they don't line up perfectly, it's okay. You can trim them down. That's the beauty of using a very clear glue. It's okay. See, mine didn't line up exactly perfect, so I'm just going to trim the tiniest bit off of each side. And then I'm going to set these aside to completely dry, because once we fold them over, then we will have 2 pockets that we will sew directly into our journals. In the meantime, I'm also going to distress the edges a little bit. I just think that, again, adds to the vibe that I'm going for in this journal, and I just use Tim Holtz Distress ink. The color is actually Vintage Photo, but I add so much random ink in there because mine gets dry that I think it's sort of a hodgepodge of different browns at this point. But I just use that little blending tool and I add that ink all the way around each side of the edges of these pockets. Now that all of my pages are glued together, I made 3 total because I'm going to have 3 signatures. I'm going to fold them in half, and now I have essentially 2 pockets to put in each signature. So these pockets will be perfect to use for receipts or photos, to use in layouts, just to hold ephemera in. They're nice, big, roomy pockets that will be the size of my journal. So now that I have these pockets done, I'm going to separate the pages that I folded in half and already trimmed down, and I'm going to separate them into 3 signatures. I'm going to be careful to make sure I have a mix of color, texture, content, length, all of the things that make for an interesting journal signature. I want to make sure that each signature has a little bit of color, a little bit of nature, a little bit of everything to make it just a little bit more interesting. That way, when I open my journal, I am super inspired to create in it because all of the pages are eclectic and inviting and warm and match the whole vibe of the journal. So now that my signatures are all separated, I am going to just start putting them together. I put one piece of paper as the very first page, and then I just sort of keep building on it. I like making sure it's really a mixture of all the fun stuff. And so that is what you see me doing here. I'll do that with all 3 of the signatures. And then once all of the signatures are completely constructed, I will need to trim them down a little bit to make sure that their width matches my journal. So you'll see what I do just to trim them down. It's a really simple process. I try to keep everything as simple as possible. I don't like overcomplicating things. I don't like using a million fancy tools. I just like using the basics and allowing my creativity to sort of be the main focus of my journals. Since all of my signatures are now constructed, I just sort of do a quick check to make sure that there's enough pages, not too many, not too little. I measure the width, and now I'm going to trim down those signatures so that they'll fit in perfectly. This is a really simple process. I just use my same paper cutter that I use for everything, and I go through and give a quick chop to all of those pages. And as you can see, we waste very little. That's all that's getting thrown away. I'm going to save all of these strips that were left over from the cardstock to use in my journaling process. And now I am going to punch the holes in the spine. I have a template that I've already pre-made. It's one that I had from a while ago that I used. And since I covered it in packing tape, I can use it again. So I'm going to use my awl, and I'm just going to punch those holes first on the inside, just so I know exactly where the holes are. And then I'm going to flip the journal over. I already can see where I previously punched some like starter holes, and now I'm going to go in from the outside. And the reason I do it from the outside is because you can see it like kind of puffs up a little bit when you punch through. So I would rather that be on the inside cover than the outside cover. So now that the holes are punched in my spine, I do need to punch the same holes into my signatures. So I use my spine as a template. I see where those holes are. I line up the signatures and I mark holes where I need to punch. That way I always have the perfect holes and everything will always line up. I don't use the template as the actual template for my pages. I only use it on the spine, and then I use the spine itself as a template for the pages. And once that step is complete, I get my awl and I punch those holes out, making sure I go all the way through every page in the signature. And then once this step is done, we can move on to sewing. Like many of you, my least favorite part of making a journal is sewing in the signatures. I don't know why. I think it's just very tedious, and there's a lot of room for error. So I always do a very basic 3-hole pamphlet stitch. It's very simple, it's very secure, and it's what I always use for my personal journals. So I'm just going to let you see. I have lots and lots of videos here on YouTube and on TikTok and on Patreon. If you were interested in seeing me do more in-depth sewing signature videos, I invite you to check them out. I have a playlist here on YouTube. I have a playlist over on TikTok, and I have a collection over on Patreon. So if you are enjoying this video, please do me a favor and give this video a like. If you are interested or have a question, please leave a comment. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. That means so much to me and it helps my channel out so very much. So now that you've seen me completely sew in that signature, I am just going to tie some knots to make sure it's really secure. And then I'm going to complete that same step with the other 2 signatures that need to be sewn into this journal. I'm always so happy once all the signatures are sewn in. The journal really begins to come to life, and it's now the fun part because we get to embellish the cover. So I'm going to add some lace to the spine. I want it to have a very imperfect look, so I'm going to rip that lace. I don't want it to be perfect. I don't want it to have straight edges. Again, that's not the vibe for this journal. So I'm just going to rip it enough that it will cover the spine, and I'll use my scissors a little bit when I need to, but other than that, I'm really just ripping. I want it to look imperfect. This is truly my favorite kind of journal to make, the one that I'm sort of intentionally trying to make and look imperfect, because I think there's just so much room for creativity. So this is particularly fun. I'm going to add this lace, and first to add it, I'm going to use some fabric tack just to make sure that it's nice and secure. I'm going to add a generous amount of fabric tack completely to the spine, and I'm going to add the lace right on top of it. Fabric tack is a very strong and flexible glue, so it will keep your lace exactly where you need it to be. And our next step will be to add Mod Podge. And the reason we're going to do that is I want it to be completely stuck down, and I also want it to have like a coating over it. I just think it looks really neat, and it looks a lot more finished. So don't be shy when you're adding that Mod Podge. Again, like I said before, it will dry completely clear. So add as much as you need so that this lace will dry completely flat. You don't want it lifting. You don't want it to come off as you open and close your journal repeatedly over and over again as you create in it. So really be mindful of using a lot, and please, please, please use your hands. You have to get into all those crevices. You want to make sure that it is completely and totally adhered. So this is a part that might get a little bit messy. And then once it dries, you'll see it dries nice and hard and flexible, and it will not lift at all. So just make sure you use a lot. That is my best advice. So now I'm going to decorate the cover. I'm just going to put something on the inside to make it the cover lie flat. Originally, I wanted to use the postcard with the little mushroom children for the cover, but it just was a little bit too wide and I didn't want to lose all of the cute imagery. So I decided to go with the postcard that is just mushrooms. And so I use my ruler just to trim it down a little bit. At this point in the video, I still wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do with the cover. So you're going to see me sort of fiddle around with the cover. I go back and forth between various hardware. I don't know if I want to use brads. I really wanted to use one of these Tim Holtz locks, but there just wasn't, it didn't call for it. I felt like I was trying a little bit too hard. So then I decided to nix the lock, and I didn't know if I wanted to use the bigger corners, if I wanted to add a vintage book page, if I wanted to use smaller photo corners. I really went back and forth. And so while I was sort of making my mind, I just sort of kept cutting things down and narrowing down my ideas. And so you'll see me here just trimming down this coffee stained piece of, it's a book page. It's actually a vintage book page. And ultimately what I end up doing is using Mod Podge to adhere that book page to the cover. And then I will add the postcard to the top. And then I will add that sort of antique bronzy metal hardware as well. I don't know why it took me so long to figure out what I wanted to do, but it truly did. So I thought I would just let you see the process. It doesn't always come as easy as it seems. Even now it's sped up and I cut a lot out. But I really truly wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I did add more distress ink. I tried to add a lot of distress ink around the entire cover just to add an overall vintage look to the book. The book didn't need a lot of help. It was extremely old, from the 50s, and in pretty rough shape when I got it. Like I said, it was headed for the trash. So I didn't need to add a ton to the book. But I do find when you add this distress ink, it does truly define the edges of the paper or the book or the fabric or whatever you're adding it to. So you'll see I don't just add it to paper. I actually go through the whole book and I add it to all of the edges. And I think it just adds a very fair amount of definition. And since my theme is fall and autumn and orange tones and browns and yellows, I think it was the perfect touch. I don't know that this is always the perfect touch for every journal, but I think it was a really fun option as a way to add some definition to the cover here. And you'll see a little bit closer to the end of when I'm done creating the actual cover, I do go through and add Liquitex gloss varnish. That way I just make sure all of these colors and all of these elements are really sealed in very nicely. And it also adds a really nice sheen to whatever images or, pieces that you're using in your journal. So once I felt like I sort of stained the book up enough, I go back to the cover and I think that I have finally decided the route I'm going to take. And so I actually use fabric tack. I thought I'd use Mod Podge. I use fabric tack, and I decide to put that vintage book page right down onto the cover. And then I will use the same glue and I will put that mushroom postcard right on the top. Making these journals takes a lot of time, mainly because I feel like I'm always waiting for something to dry. And so the good news is most of the glues we use, especially fabric tack, dry very quickly. But I do feel like quite a lot of the time that I'm making a journal is waiting for something to dry. So I'm going to stick these both down, Once they are dry, I am going to add this Liquitex gloss varnish like I mentioned before, and I'm going to be very generous in how much I apply because I do want to make sure that all of these colors and layers are completely sealed in well, so that when I create and when I use this journal, once it's complete, I know it will last for years and years to come. You will want to wait for this to completely dry in between layers. I usually do 2 or 3, and then I give it a good couple of hours before I go to continue on to the next step. And for me, the next step will be adding these 2 really beautiful pieces of cardstock to the inside covers, just for a more decorative touch. These are from that paper pad from Joann's that was called Simple Life. I am going to use fabric tack to glue these down. I do recommend using fabric tack because that is what will stick best to that fabric strip that we are using for our spine. So I do highly recommend using fabric tack for this step. Then once you do the front cover, you can do the back cover and you will be done. I just think this looks really pretty and adds a nice finished look. Alrighty, folks, we're nearing the end of this tutorial. We're just adding some finishing touches. I decide to add these bronzy gold little metal hardware pieces. They're like corners that are flat back. I'm going to use E6000 to apply them directly to the cover, and I do this after I have already sealed the cover. Do this in a well-ventilated area. E6000 does smell very strong. Sometimes I'll use these little clips just to hold them down because the metal isn't perfect. Another tip is to keep some toothpicks handy, because if that E6000 sort of pushes through the filigree metal, you can use those toothpicks to sort of gently and carefully get that glue out of those middle pieces. So I will go ahead and continue to show you how I do this. It's a very simple process, so I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video because I'm sure it can be a little bit boring to watch, but I did want you to see, and I do want you to know that it is important to let these completely dry, which will take several hours. I highly recommend letting it dry completely overnight. So the last bit of finishing touches that I'm going to add in this video will be adding some tabs and other little eclectic pieces. I will have a journal charm tutorial, the journal charm that I made that you saw in the first video when this YouTube began. I will have that video, but it will be a separate video because this one is already so long. So for this video, I'm going to end it by showing you how I make some very easy no-sew tabs. These are all little vintage pieces of trim, except for this trim, it's by Tim Holtz. I just cut pieces that are about 3 or 4 inches. I tried to keep them all in the same color tone. And then I'm going to start the very easy process of just using my stapler to add them directly into the journal. If you have a sewing machine and the patience, that looks beautiful too. I have neither one of those things. So I am going to use my staple. And to be honest, I really love the contrast of metal and fabric. The other little fun piece that I'm going to add to use as a tab is this Viewmaster reel. I am simply going to measure where I want that reel. I'm going to put it in one of those pockets, so I'm just going to punch through one side of the pocket with my crocodile. Then I'm going to use a large gold brad. I'm going to stick it right through that hole. That brad needs to be bigger than the hole in the Viewmaster. And then I am just going to stick it right down, and now it will spin and it will act as a tab and a decorative little piece. That Viewmaster was actually the petrified forest, so it also fits into the theme, my overall theme here. So I'm just going to add these pieces of vintage trim in a very haphazard way to create an eclectic look. Obviously, if you don't have vintage trim, you can use any trim that you can find, or you could even just use fabric pieces or paper pieces or rickrack, whatever you have available. The next cute little touch I'm going to add are these Tim Holtz butterflies. They're transparent butterflies by Tim Holtz. You're going to see it's a very simple process. I have some gold paper clips. I'm going to get some clear tape. I want the clear cellophane tape, not the cloudy tape. And then I'm just going to tape it directly to the back of that paper clip, and I'm going to stick it right into the top of my journal. Super easy. These little butterflies are not very expensive. I want to say I got them on sale and they only cost like $3, and you get all of these Tim Holtz butterflies. So you could make a ton of these little paper clip embellishments for very inexpensive. I got my gold paper clips on Amazon. I always use gold paper clips because that's what I use for my removable charms. So that's what I'm using here. And do make sure you have the clear, completely clear cellophane tape, not the cloudy Scotch tape. I love these little butterflies so much that I thought I would actually tape some to the inside cover as well. Many times I'll add a library card to the inside cover of my journal, but I just didn't really feel called to for this journal. So since I love these butterflies so much, I figured I would use some of this vintage style tape that I made. That's a very simple DIY. I will link the tutorial here. I posted that tutorial to TikTok, so that will be in the description box below. So I'm just going to use that vintage aged tape, and I'm going to tape a few right to the inside cover, and I think it makes a really pretty little embellishment as well. And that is it for this tutorial, folks. If you hung in there with me for the whole video, give me a comment. I want to say thank you to you. I know this one was long, but I had a lot of fun documenting this process, and this turned out to be a very special journal to me. So it was fun to share it here on YouTube. So if you made it all the way through, give me a thumbs up, and I want to be able to say thank you to you. My next tutorial will be for the journal charm. You will see it here in a moment. I had a lot of fun creating that as well, and I can't wait to show you. If you're looking for additional content, mail from me every month, and lives every other day, please follow me over on Patreon. All of that information is linked below. It's a fun, happy, crafty community, and we would love to have you there. So thank you so much for joining me in this very lengthy video. I hope you have a really good day, and thanks for watching. Bye.